Welcome back to Tide Pod. Today is Friday, November 24th. And once again, we do not have perfect attendance on the podcast. Brandon is back, though. We had just Tony and I last week, and then Tony is out for this one. But Brandon's back, so glad to have you back, Brandon. And we'll get right into it. I mean, I know, the main thing we're going to do is obviously preview the Auburn game just because, given Alabama's most recent opponent, I don't know how much stock you can put into their performance against Chattanooga. But from watching that game, just diving right in, what were your thoughts? Obviously, took care of business and then some against the mighty Mocs of Chattanooga. But what'd you take away from that game against the FCS side?
For me, I mean, it was very reminiscent of the Alabama of old. Even early in this year, even we saw Alabama play some inferior opponents, and against the Middle Tennessee State, against the USF, Middle Tennessee, there was definitely a lot of upside in that game. We saw a glimpse of what we see now in Jalen Milroe, but then the USF game, obviously was what it was. But last weekend to see Alabama put up 66, that's a big deal. Just because Alabama has been known to put up major numbers, play the backups, and get them the experience they need, and to see Alabama get back to that really throughout the course of this year was big for them on multiple fronts.
Yeah, I think that was something Saban seemed to emphasize was he was glad at how many players were able to get in and get some action. And I think that was one of the main things we were looking for, in terms of some of the younger players getting involved. I'll use this opportunity to ask you this because I was going to ask if you were going to be on before the Chattanooga game. From a recruiting standpoint, who are some maybe younger guys that you enjoyed seeing who maybe haven't had the chance to get as much run earlier this year that it was nice to see them kind of have a decent game against Chattanooga?
Transparently, I have to go back and look at the tape. Once Alabama went up, 30, 40 plus, it was kind of hard for me to have my attention on it just transparently. But I feel like across the board, there were some defensive players that were able to get some burn. I have to look at the stats on that end. And just relatively, I was just looking at seeing younger guys get out there. Even like one player that actually is starting to gain a little bit of buzz, Edric Houston. Edric Hill, excuse me, from Missouri, 2023 commit, major class. He's one of the guys that came in with that defensive line that was star-studded. To see him start to get some reps in the interior definitely stood out to me because that defensive line class was so talented, so touted. And obviously there's been some players that we haven't seen get as much burn as you would expect, even like, for instance, Keon Keeley. But to see some of those players on the defensive side of the ball get some reps, I mean, that's one thing that I've grown up knowing Nick Saban to be is a defensive mind. And you always want to see that next guy up, especially with Dallas Turner headed on, most likely Kool-Aid McKinstry, seeing him, kind of pass the torch, not purposefully, but pass the torch to Caleb Downs as far as, being the punt returner. And then, even to see, the linebacking core, start to get some rotated snaps, but to see, potentially Chris Braswell, having some considerations after the season as well. So across the board, it was major for me to see, especially on the defensive side, because that's what I've grown to know Saban to be, is that defensive mind.
Yeah, I'd have that defensive depth too, to where you have these, really good players that can come off the bench and you're like, geez, it's just a pipeline. You touched on it. I do want to talk a little bit about Jalen Milroe too, but I'll go to Kool-Aid first because you mentioned that, that was the big thing that Tony and I were talking about before that game, a storyline to follow. And of course, maybe the biggest storyline of the game was Kool-Aid McKinstry fumbling another punt, obviously in the first quarter. Had the return, had it poked away, and then he was pulled from return duties for Caleb Downs, who, like you said, has been awesome as a freshman on defense. And then he himself returning a punt for, I think it was 80 something yards, and for a touchdown. He threw up the peace sign on the way in the end zone. Were you not surprised to see Kool-Aid replaced on that front, and what do you make of Caleb maybe taking the punt return duties moving forward?
Definitely surprised. It seems like Kool-Aid's a guy that Saban has a lot of confidence in. He's been one of the most consistent players in that secondary, for really the last 2 years. But Caleb Downs came with a lot of buzz. He's lived up to that buzz at multiple different fronts, especially to come in and play the way he has. And I think Saban just knows where the future of the team is headed. And, for him, he understands that Downs will be that leader on the back end. And, if you can use his skills, especially in this year where you're seeing a lot of opportunity, a chance at potentially the college football playoff, you have Georgia on the horizon, despite, the game this weekend. You look at those factors and you say, okay, maybe we need to make this transition just because it's better for the team and not just for one player.
Yeah, I think you're right. It was a tricky spot because, the calls started to get louder. At this late stage in the season, you thought, okay, maybe Saban wasn't gonna go with somebody else. He wasn't gonna make that transition, like you said. But I think he was right to do it. And I think, he very staunchly defended Kool-Aid McKinstry after he fumbled the punt against Kentucky and came out and was like, we got faith in our guys. Teammates need to do better, not running into him and stuff like that. But I think this one more error probably pushed it over the line. I think you might as well give the freshman a chance. And the nice thing this week is Kool-Aid McKinstry, I think, had a quote where he doesn't seem bitter about giving away the punt return duties. He wants to do whatever it takes for this team to win. And if that's somebody else going back there, I think that's a good thing. It seems like it's a trend in college football too, where you don't have as many of your stars, even if they're speedsters like Kool-Aid is. You don't want them risking injury on punt returns. I think that's another, kind of big factor too. But I think ultimately the right decision for Nick Saban there. Let's talk about the man who continues to just, make headlines and improve as the season goes on. Jalen Milroe, of course, did not play the full game on Saturday. I think if he had, that would have been probably an issue if they needed to keep him in there, if it was that close. But of course got pulled, but went 13 for 16, 197 yards and 3 touchdowns. And I know it's Chattanooga, Brandon, but about as good as you can be. I mean, for the time that you're on the field. And like, I was talking to this about this with Tony, last week, and it's not even to say that he's necessarily in this conversation where he'll be getting the invite to New York, but the guy still has odds you can bet on for the Heisman Trophy. And like, it's been pretty impressive to see him like work his way back into the elite conversation, or the conversation for elite quarterbacks this year. Given what happened with him in the UCF game, given that he was benched literally this season. I mean, just whether it's this game or just in general, what's your take kind of on Milroe and where he's at this point?
I think going into the season, I think the reason that Alabama had, the buzz and was picked, I think, by everybody on College Game Day going into the season to be that, national title contender was simply because, despite Caleb Williams returning and Michael Penix, who has been quite a surprise, there was a lot of uncertainty at the quarterback position across the board. And so a player like Jalen Milroe, people saw some flashes, but, didn't know that he could have this type of performances going into the year. But also, I'm sure people expected that Saban would be focused and that them as a team would come together. And so for me, Milroe has definitely surprised. But he isn't surprised he's surprised because of how he's been able to play in the big games. But he's went to what he knows, which is running the football, making sure that's a priority. And then he's allowed, what he does on the offensive end as far as his passing to kind of play off of what he does in the run game. And, respect to the offensive line for starting to open up holes for, you mentioned a couple players that you're looking for, Justice Hayes, who definitely got off on Saturday, and kind of saw his best performance of the year, and to have Milroe to complement players like that, has been phenomenal. Never did I expect, going into this year that Milroe would have opportunity at it, but heck, who would expect that Carson Beck may be able to get there as well?
Yeah, I think you're right. It definitely is helped that there's a lot of parity at the quarterback position. There isn't just like 2 players that have run away with it, but I think he deserves a lot of credit. And Saban has given that to him, to be fair, of just how far he's gone, where you can throw him in as like the 5th or 6th best odds to win the Heisman, for a guy who is at Alabama and going to be, maybe on the bench. Like, I think that's going to be huge. But yeah, I mean, Milroe, like, he just continues to get better. And obviously, the big tests are coming. You mentioned those big games, Brandon. I know, Saban won't want to be overlooking Auburn here this week. And that's certainly a big game with it being in Jordan-Hare, and it can go every which way, as we've seen. And and stuff like that. But and again, you mentioned Georgia on the horizon too, and if they have aspirations to get where they want to go, he's going to have to continue to step up. And before we get into Auburn, I do want to broaden it out like we've kind of been doing with perhaps where Alabama could end up depending on its result in the Georgia game. Crimson Tide, of course, we're recording this on Wednesday. So last night, the playoff rankings come out. Alabama still number 8. I think much to the continued chagrin, perhaps, of Crimson Tide fans. I think me and Tony just, like when we were talking about it last week, just enjoy the speculation. So I'm going to do the same thing with you, Brandon. How, I guess, worried should Alabama fans be? Maybe perhaps how worried are you that, maybe even with a good result against Georgia and obviously without one, what are the odds you think this team somehow misses the playoff if all goes right?
Well, if all goes right, they make the playoff, right?
Yeah.
If all goes right.
I mean, I would hope so. That would be the logical thing to me. But the College Football Playoff Committee is sometimes quite the opposite.
I think, there's a couple factors at play. Going into the year, I had Texas a 10-12 win team, so I'm not really surprised by their result. And really that week, I really should have picked them to beat Alabama. I just could sense it. But I don't think that loss is going to be too terrible. I mean, I think Texas will have opportunity to play Oklahoma State, and Oklahoma State's been poor. But, there could be some opportunities there in the Big 12 because that's really the only spot that's available is via Texas. In the Pac-12, and we're looking at Washington, who almost kind of fumbled one last week, and then an Oregon team who may get the nod. But I think Pac-12 is on their way to earning one. I transparently believe that Florida State goes down this weekend, as crazy as that sounds. I think that's just a big win for Napier, and I think, it's one they need to get done. So, if Florida State loses weekend or even next, they're out. And to some degree, their value is kind of diminished without Jordan Travis because now there's question marks. As far as the Big Ten, it comes down to, if it comes down to public perception in some ways. I mean, one, if Ohio State wins, I think, most people will be happy to keep Michigan out, with just like the sign stealing. If Michigan wins, it could make things interesting, especially with Ohio State, coming in as the number one, with the number one ranking in the first rankings, the college football rankings of the year. And, but it's a week-to-week basis. I mean, the last 2 weeks we've seen Georgia, beat people over the head by 20-plus points, and suddenly the narrative has changed. So, I think as long as Alabama handles their business, goes out, wins the SEC championship, wins this weekend in decisive fashion, they're going to give the committee plenty to consider. And, one thing that I've always done, just as someone who is an avid watcher of college football, is understand that it's a week-to-week game, and that, even when we feel like we have the ranking set or the teams that won't lose, somehow they end up losing, and then everything always plays out. I think the committee still has a lot of respect for Alabama, and they see the progression. I think it's just a matter of them winning in decisive fashion. If they win this weekend in decisive fashion, they win in Atlanta in decisive fashion, it's going to be very hard to keep that team out.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just, it's that patience, right? Where, fans have been waiting for this chaos to happen in front of them to help push Alabama, above Oregon and Texas mainly right now, or even Florida State. Everyone's been waiting for that chaos, and I think the reason people just get more worried is because that chaos hasn't happened yet, and you're running out of opportunities for it too. I think you're right with Florida State. They have been very clear that they will, limit teams or hurt team stock if players get injured, because you're right about the whole, there's not as much appeal. There's not as much, added to it if a Jordan Travis isn't healthy. And I don't think it's wild to say with him injured that Florida can win that game. They very much can. We were talking about it before we started, like, especially if Graham Mertz was playing in that game, I think you'd have a very good shot for the Gators. They took a top 10 Missouri team to the wire. So, that could get interesting. I just worry. For me, it's Texas that I worry about. I just feel like if it does all boil down, if enough chaos happens to where you're deciding between Alabama and Texas, I find it really hard for them to ignore that head-to-head game. I just don't. I don't know if the committee will do that, as much as that could, frighten Alabama fans. But, maybe it's a situation where Florida State loses and you sneak Texas and Alabama in there somehow. If it's, you cheer for a Washington and then the Big Ten champ and then those two. There's all sorts of scenarios you could go in it. Maybe to ask a little bit of a different question, without going through every single possible outcome for all 7 or 8 of these top teams. Say Alabama does make the playoff, as the 3 or the 4 seed, depending on what happens elsewhere. Um, you know, which opponent do you think, looking at the landscape of college football, do you think you would like to see Alabama matched up with the most? Whether it's just a fun game for you or with what gives them maybe the best chance to reach that national championship game.
So we're only talking about the first round?
Yeah, so I guess the semifinal, and then maybe, if you want to speculate it all the way to the national championship, go for it.
Hey man, we're on Speculation Wednesday, huh?
You gotta be. We'll get into Auburn in a minute, but yeah, it's it's that time of the year.
If they're the 4 seed, I'm assuming that means, well, they have to be like the 3 if they beat Georgia. Really, I feel like they can't be the 4 if they beat Georgia. They have to be a 3 or a 2. So then I don't see them playing Georgia again because they may, drop Georgia to 4. I don't think they'd want an immediate rematch if Georgia loses, because then, it's going to be hard to keep Georgia if they win this weekend just because of body of work. If Texas gets in, which they're about to reach my win total, I could see that rematch. But I personally, I think Texas is due for one in the next 2 games. They played a lot of teams tight, and, I had them at 12 max, which would potentially be a playoff, but I don't know if I see it. I think the Pac-12, they're going to give them one because the last year of the conference, they have 2 eligible teams, and, transparently, it's hard to beat a team twice. So I could see Alabama against Oregon. I'm going to stick with my Florida State thing, because I said it a couple weeks back, and it even, there's even more credit to it because Florida lost last week the way they did, that I think Florida State will fall either next week or even this week, but I think it's going to be this week. So then it comes down to the 2 Big Ten teams, because at that point they would put them in. So I could say the matchup of Oregon would probably be possible, and or Michigan. Yeah. If Alabama gets Michigan, I think they can handle either team in the Big Ten. Ohio State's an intriguing matchup just because of Harrison, but in my opinion, Ohio State's kind of been a little bit wish-washy on a weekly basis.
Me too.
I don't even know why they put them at number 1. They were just so decisive. They beat Notre Dame in the last second. So, I guess for the sake of your question, the best matchup would be Michigan if all these things come into play, or maybe I would say one of the Big Ten teams would be
either
the best.
One.
Yeah, because Oregon and Bo Nix and his experience is something that you have to pay attention to, because he's a Big Ten guy, and even for him, if they put him against Georgia, that could be interesting because he's been kind of waiting for that rematch. He didn't get it last year, and even Washington, I've been kind of waiting for them to lose, but they have a lot of receiver. You're right. They have a lot of receiver weapons. I don't know if they'll be able to handle either one of those SEC defenses, but I'd say the Big Ten teams can present the best opportunity for Alabama to move to the next round, and then at that point, it's winner take all.
Yeah, I think you make some good points. I would agree. I hadn't even thought about that hypothetical of a Kool-Aid McKinstry versus Marvin Harrison possibly on the outside. If that's how that plays out, that would be super fun. Ohio State's out,
even though
Alabama.
me and you both know that they won't be matched up in a man matchup. There's going to be some.
Yeah, the packages won't allow, but we can dream. We can dream. Just that the thought of that secondary and how great they've been trying to contain a guy like him would be very fun. I think an Oregon Alabama game would be very fun, like you said, with Bo Nix and his, the bodacious narrative. Maybe he's got the Heisman if they beat Washington, and he's got that rolling with him on the way in. But yeah, I think you make some some very good points. And I think I agree with you. Both the Big Ten teams, like, it's come down for me to this week, which with whichever one wins, I'm like, all right, they're pretty legit. But both of them, haven't moved me so much this season, and that's in part due to the Big Ten itself just not being as good. But yeah, I mean, whatever happens, whether it's Michigan, one of the Big Ten, or the other Big Ten school, Ohio State, Oregon, Washington, I mean, you got to get there first. That's what matters. And we'll get to the Georgia game obviously next week. But let's segue now and look at this Auburn matchup. Look at this Iron Bowl game, which has a very interesting wrinkle to it now with Auburn's most recent result. And that's, I think, where I'll go first. Like, mentally, like, how do you prepare a team now that is about to face, instead of a 7-win Auburn squad, it's a team that just lost to New Mexico State, and now you might be overlooking them a little bit. Now you're like, oh, Auburn's nothing. Like, and I will give credit, by the way, to New Mexico State. They're 9-3. They're having a great year. But yeah, he's great. But what's kind of the mindset? Do you think Saban has it just been the same that it is all week, especially that it's the Iron Bowl, it's in Jordan-Hare, but facing a team that had a weird, unfortunate for them result last week?
I mean, I don't think Saban's ever been one to get too high, and I think this team is still. I mean, I think the college football rankings are helpful in this situation. I mean, right now, as you said, they're kind of on the outside looking in. So if they have any prayer, any chance of, playing in that college football playoff, they have to beat Auburn this weekend. So I don't think they overlook them, especially when you take into account the recruiting battles that have been on hand in the state. Some of the battles there at play. Auburn getting some guys that Alabama wanted, no doubt about it, and Alabama maybe making a push for some of the guys that Auburn did get. And so just on that respect alone, I don't see a Nick Saban coach team coming into this game flat. I think, the game being on the road, the magnitude of the game, all those things factor into, what this game means. So for me, looking at, just how Saban has coached his teams in the past, I expect them to be ready to play. And even, what Auburn offers on the offensive side of the ball, yeah, they've shown some promise. And, kudos to Coach Freeze, for showing some promise in year one. But at the end of the day, offensively, in my opinion, Auburn just doesn't offer that much of a threat offensively, and defensively, there's still some things they're building towards. So, of course, the game last week was a surprise, but I don't expect Saban and company to get any surprises going into the game at Jordan-Hare. I think they're going to be ready. They're going to be locked in, and they understand the mission at hand, because if they overlook this matchup, no matter what they do next week, it's over.
Yeah. I mean, that's been the message since the Texas game, and I think it does. You're right. The number 8 ranking, I think, does help. You can have that little more natural underdog mentality rather than like, oh, you're the team everyone's looking at to rip down from the top of the pedestal. You're the team trying to climb up there now, and that hasn't been the case for Alabama for a while, and that remains the case here on Saturday. It's an interesting Auburn team. Looking at some of the things Saban said. He complimented 3 guys: their tight end Rivaldo Fairweather, their wideout Jay Fair, and then the running back Jacquez Hunter has been good. They're not bad on offense. And actually, looking at Tony's article, he talked with a guy from the Montgomery Advisor who covers Auburn. Talked about Fairweather as a name to watch. He's in at least Richard Silva, the Montgomery Advisor guy's eyes, has had quietly one of the better seasons in Auburn history at tight end. So, he may be a matchup to watch. But, Saban described this game as it seems like it's going to be a slugfest. Auburn runs the ball well. They have a decent run defense too. And that's where I guess I'll go next is you mentioned Justice Haynes. He's someone who I was calling on or hoping would have a big game against Chattanooga. But obviously he's a little bit lower down on the depth chart. What are you expecting from, Alabama's rushing attack, especially with Milroe in there as a threat? Do you think they'll have their way kind of with what's been a decent Auburn run defense? I believe they rank, I think I wrote it down. They rank 22nd in the country. Oh, sorry, that's rush offense. I'll get to that stat. Never mind. I'm saving that one. But they're a good rush defense. They can stop the run decently well.
Well, I, like you, was a little bit surprised that Justice hasn't earned more playing time this year. I think he dealt with some injuries. Even when I saw him, he had like a elbow brace on. But I thought, going into the year, he was going to be, kind of in that truly top three running back that rotates in. So I was happy as well to see him, get some burn last week and have some success. As far as Auburn's concerned, and their ability to potentially stop Milroe and the running attack, one thing, early in the year is the running game struggled, in my opinion. They weren't getting those breakout runs. They weren't, putting up the numbers that they had previously, obviously because, the running back room is a lot different than it is in the past, right? Just body types, names, etc. That said, you have to kind of look at who Auburn's faced this year and how many quarterbacks have they faced with the ability and the dynamic nature that Milroe possesses, right? Where he can throw. Um, he has solid throwing ability, but his strength is to be able to run the ball. And lately, his aggressiveness and in his attack as far as attacking the defense has been top notch. When he makes a decision, he makes the decision and goes with it, especially when it comes to using his feet. So for me, when I look at an Auburn team that has some strengths on that defensive side of the ball, at the end of the day, last week they didn't have those strengths, obviously. And this week, with a tougher opponent with more weapons at their disposal and a team that is really kind of harped on the running game, especially with Milroe back there, I just see them continue to have some success. There may be some slugfest nature in it, maybe early on, but if Alabama wants to be in the college football playoff, no matter how Coach Saban sells it, they need to win in a big way.
Yeah, I mean, great teams find ways to win these games, especially on the road. I mean, it's much more of a statement game than I think people realize with where Auburn's record is. It might not feel as much that it is as much, but I think certainly you're right that Alabama has to make Auburn play its game. And on defense, this is where I'll get to the stat I was going to mention. I talked about Jarquez Hunter, their running back. Last year in the Iron Bowl, 134 yards and 11 carries. Auburn as a whole racked up 318 total yards in the Iron Bowl. And currently this year, Auburn ranks number 22 in the country, averaging just under 200 rushing yards per game. And this is interesting, going back to what Richard Silva said. The way New Mexico State seemed to stop Auburn's rushing attacks was actually by just keeping Auburn off the field. They killed it on the time of possession. And just had the ball for way longer. Didn't really let Auburn have a chance to sort of establish itself on the ground. Do you think that might be the strategy for Saban to some extent? Is just your best defense is your offense, keep them off the field, or are you fairly confident that should Auburn have a little bit more looks than they did against New Mexico State, that the kind of front seven and whatnot of Alabama can just shut it down?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to trust in Coach Saban's physicality. And his want to, on the defensive side of the ball. I could see Alabama taking that strategy if they were New Mexico State, but thankfully they're Alabama. And so that strategy, as far as keeping the ball away from a team, especially a team like Auburn, I don't expect that to be in play. If Alabama has an opportunity to score, I expect them to score the football. And whenever Auburn gets the ball, I expect them to step up defensively and make the stops where they need to, because if you notice with New Mexico State, they're a quote unquote inferior opponent. So you have to come in with a strategy like that, a game plan that basically plays to the strengths of keeping the ball away from a more talented team, where I don't think there's any question that Alabama has more talent. And they're going to play their game. Whenever you're the top dog, for lack of better terms, you make the other team play your game. You don't play their game, meaning keeping the ball away from them and trying to do things that are conducive to slowing them down. No, you just play your game. You go out there and line up, and if you hit them in the mouth enough early and often, they're gonna have to eventually throw the ball, because guess what? The running game wasn't working. And so last year, we can point to that, but last year, in that the latter half of the season, there was a lot of questions about Alabama as a team, and really at that point they weren't playing for a college football playoff anymore. So a little bit of that motivation was kind of probably missing a little bit, especially when you factor in that Nick Saban would go on to remove their defensive coordinator. So there was already some changes on the horizon versus this team. They still have a goal to play for. A national championship is still available. And if they want to be in that national championship conversation to win it this year, defense wins championships. And, what a better week than this as far as Auburn's Iron Bowl is concerned to step up and be that defensive juggernaut.
Yeah, it feels to me that Auburn already, has made itself a little bit one-dimensional. I don't think Peyton Thorne is a very good quarterback at all, truthfully. And that's hurt Auburn. But they have stuck around, thanks to their run game in some games. I mean, they were the first team this year that kind of pushed Georgia, and that game was also in Jordan-Hare. It was also a midday kickoff. That's something
that game was also at the beginning of the year when Carson Beck was still getting his feet wet and Georgia was struggling to South Carolina down 14-0 at halftime. So I want to give Auburn some credit here, but
that's fair. I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, Carson Beck has excelled
at that same point in the season. I think Alabama was struggling to score points too.
Yeah. So teams, both teams have kind of come a long way in terms of Georgia and Alabama, which may be a glimpse into next year. But I want to revisit the past for a second because you mentioned that game last year. This is an interesting thing looking at it. Alabama, this is the first time in a long time, I think I wrote it down, since 1981, that a senior class or guys that came in can go 4 out of 4 against Auburn. They've beat them the last 3 years. They haven't beat them 4 years in a row since the 80s, consecutively. So, how does that kind of play into it? And then just, if you could just give your input on this rivalry in general, maybe talk about the game last year, even just, walk us back through memory lane. I know Auburn is doing the commemorative mug for the kick six. They have I don't know if you saw that, but they're doing a mug and it has the radio call inscribed on the back of it. Cause of course that's been 10 years. If you wanted to feel old, but just kind of what's the, I guess, yeah, just walk us back through memory lane of this rivalry and what it means maybe for, some of these Alabama seniors to maybe go 4 out of 4 here in their careers against Auburn.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, one, it's just such a surprise with the dominance that Saban's had that this could potentially be the first class, to go 4 for 4, in the last, 15 plus years. That's just so surprising. But when you factor in some of those wins that Auburn's had over the history, really the recent history, and we have a Cam Newton win where, they had a transfer quarterback. He wins the Heisman, wins the national championship. So the dream scenario, we have the year of the kick six where they beat Georgia on some late Hail Mary type play. And in that same season, they have the kick six. And so, those are both two wins that may have stopped a senior class from going 4 for 4 potentially on some kind of flukish stuff. But that's kind of how no shade to Auburn, but that's kind of how I've known them to be. They are the little brother to Alabama, and whenever they win, it's usually close, tight. Something weird happened. I usually just don't see Auburn just physically going and dominate Coach Saban and company. Even just when you look back on it, whenever they went to the SEC championship under Gus Malzahn when they played Georgia, and Georgia went on to win. Georgia went on to win, and they played Alabama later in the national championship. Even that year, had some unique things that had to happen. So, for me, I just go into the matchup saying, Alabama is usually the dominant. In this, I see them as the little brother, just like I see Texas A&M as the little brother to Texas, just as I see Michigan as a little brother to Ohio State, even though that's changed a little bit. And just with as much buzz Auburn has cultivated since the offseason to hire Coach Freeze, since the NIL situations, some of the in-state players they've got, people in Tuscaloosa are paying attention to that. They know that they're trying to get some players they want. They know they're big spenders. They know what this rivalry means. And so for me, when I just look at the history of it and I look where the rivalry is headed, I just know that this is going to be a very focused team. And, we're just with everything on the line, I just don't have faith in Auburn. Despite the loss last week, they could have won last week, and I just still wouldn't have the confidence. You can say they're going to play gritty and nitty, and they're going to be, playing with their hair on fire. And that's good, again, until you get hit in the mouth, for a quarter, 2, 3. And so historically, I have my faith in Alabama, and this weekend, I have my faith in Alabama.
Yeah, I think that, looking for that fourth does put a little bit of weirdness to it, especially because it is in Jordan Hare when, like you said, some of those weird games, they happen way more there in this rivalry than they do over in Bryant Denny. Something to home field advantage, I guess. But yeah, I think I have the faith in Alabama too, and it just, you're right. I think it's just a a mix of, this team has had the same message for so long. I think they get to Georgia, and that's where, you start to get nervous, where it has this Georgia team found its stride, to the extent of how Alabama seems to have found its stride. And that'll be, a much more up in the air game. But I do think they get through the Iron Bowl. But again, we're allowed to look past it. Obviously, these players are not. And it doesn't seem like that's been the vibe. And maybe to spin zone it a little bit with going with this, getting this fourth win. I mean, these seniors are like, yeah, like that would suck to have that mark on our careers where not only do we miss the playoff, have a disappointing end of the year, but yeah, we couldn't be the ones to do it. We couldn't be the ones to get all four over Auburn. So they want to, they're competitive. I'm sure they want to, win as much of those games as possible. So we'll see how that all goes. This is where I get to put you on the spot again, Brandon. Your favorite thing, just like from the LSU game. Give me a score prediction for Alabama Auburn. It's a little bit easier, it seems like, than maybe this LSU game.
I mean, I don't know if it's my favorite thing. In the LSU game, I mean, they did knock Jaden Daniels out the game, so that
They
definitely
did.
factors in. But credit to Dallas Turner for being a quarterback killer. Good for him. Positively. I mean, honestly, yeah, I do expect a dominant performance, so I'll just cut it, straight to the point. 34-14, Bama.
34-14 Bama. Yeah, I think I'm gonna go a similar vibe. I will go 38-21, just to be a little bit more high scoring, but similar, you know, type of vibe. Brandon, I also want to get into, you answered it a little bit already with just talking. You talked about how the Iron Bowl, in terms of Alabama and Auburn recruiting, of course, in each other's backyard all the time. And you mentioned Auburn kind of has gotten the edge on a couple of guys. Just want to get a recruiting update from you. And I do want to ask if you want to expand on that at all. I know you kind of answered it. How does this game kind of impact recruiting in the way Alabama does it? Especially when they're on the road, does that kind of hurt them a little bit more than when this game is at home? And then just, what's been new this past week plus in the recruiting world for the Crimson Tide?
Well, I mean, to say it hurts them, more or less. I mean, heck, I'm sure Coach Saban and company would want every game to be at Bryant Denny if they
Fair.
could, right? Because that means you can have recruits on campus and yada yada yada, blase blase. But me and you both know that some of the recruits that are considering Auburn this weekend who will be on campus are considering Alabama. So at the end of the day, they're just paying attention to how the game plays out and ultimately those relationships. And it goes back to the buzz, going into this year as far as what Hugh Freeze is bringing to the table, being very flashy about the NIL, being flashy about paying players, versus a Coach Saban who doesn't really speak on it too much. Is more of like that old school vibe, and kudos to him for it because I'm for it. But there's kind of a conflict of interest as far as where the state's headed, just even on how you recruit. But that said, Auburn definitely made some waves. With DeMarcus Reddick, a player that Alabama definitely wanted, being able to flip a Perry Thompson. Being involved with players like Alvin Henderson, Malik Autry, who Alabama's going to definitely have their shot at it again, and several others. Anquan Fagans. This is a big battle not only for the 2024 class that's almost wrapped up, but really the 25 and the 26 and 25 is very special, as we can kind of already see with Alabama's current class right now. But across the board, I think just from an in-state perspective, this is going to play a huge role for the 25 and 26 groups. I mean, even with players like Cam Coleman, who could be flirting a little bit, with the oust of Jimbo Fisher, and some reports that Auburn's definitely made some moves. I think players across the state, despite what money means to them, at the end of the day, winning is going to take care of the money at the end of the day. And so, to win on Saturday would be huge. I say Alabama, if we're talking more recruiting, they're definitely making some strides outside the state.
Yeah.
But this game, in my opinion, is most pivotal for all the guys in the state, not so much out the state.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you said that. Like, I was curious about just how much that weighs because I know, like, yeah, it's, it is just one game, but, for these in state guys, like, they've been interviewing guys all week who are on the team right now and talking about how much this rivalry means to them. And, oh, I grew up an Auburn fan. My ex and ex family member grew up an Auburn fan. They're an Alabama fan now. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a big deal to not only the fans, but for these kids who are growing up as fans, to see kind of the results. And yeah, I think you're right. Seems like it would turn a lot of heads, um, you know, within the state in terms of looking at Auburn being like, oh, maybe they're a little bit more on the right track than we thought. Outside of the state, anything else major wise with recruiting, anything major to keep an eye on? You mentioned the 24 class, kind of that cycle reaching its end soon, but then 25, should be a special one.
Yeah, I mean, 25, we can get to that, but 24 is definitely heating up. I think we'll see some pages turn as we get to the end of this week. I think Bama could get some good news soon. I think a commitment's on the horizon. Definitely, there's the commitment on the horizon for sure. But there's a lot of players at play. You saw Jordan Seaton drop his top 7 the other day, a major target, fresh off of an official visit to Colorado. After Coach Prime, announced how much they need linemen. But Seaton has been a major target for Alabama. I mean, for some time now. And so that'd be a major win for them in the state of Florida, where it also seems like Alabama's spending a lot more time there, especially to close out this 24 class. Another name to watch is Adarius Hayes out of Largo, Florida, linebacker, flirted with Alabama early, was on campus for the LSU game and has a good relationship with Joseph Ayata out of Florida as well. And we've seen recently, how the Florida class has been hit. I think Georgia got a player. I think there's like 2 other players that decommit as well. So there's a lot of vulnerability in that class. And it seems to me that Alabama wants to bring in at least one more linebacker. So Hayes is definitely a guy to watch. Another player to watch is Keywan Lacey out of Lancaster, Texas. He was a player that, last year when I lived in Texas, he was they were flirting with him and things kind of died off just because of how his junior season played out. But he's been the guy for them this year, the focal option, and recruitment for him has picked up with the Tide really the last couple months, which probably potentially played a factor into his decommitment from Nebraska. And if you look at Alabama's class this year, there's no running back, right? Daniel Hill was a name and is a name that's been being continuously mentioned in the class because they do want to bring in that running back target. But it seems to me that South Carolina is really pushing hard here, despite some sources close to him really wanting him to be, a member of the Alabama Crimson Tide. So, running back position seems like a spot that's about to get filled, and there'll be some names that come up. Even another name that has kind of been off the radar for a little bit is Kevin Riley, local talent out of North Point. I mean, 10 minutes away from Tuscaloosa, who's starting to entertain some interest from the Tide as well. But when I look at the class as a whole, 24 is about to have some fireworks late. It's kind of decommitment season, as we've seen for multiple guys. And, I don't want to give away all the eggs in the basket, but, flip season is here for multiple people. And, there's one player that could enter the fold before December 17th through 19th that, at the receiver position that Alabama fans would be very, very happy about. I'll have something on it a little bit later, but I guess for the sake of podcast, let's just say that Perry Thompson, maybe things are getting warm again.
Oh, that was a good tease, and everyone go check out Brandon's stuff on it. But yeah, plenty to go around. It seems like running back, maybe this Thompson situation. It is flip season. It is decommitment season. It gets busy at the end. Guys kind of second guess and second guessing stuff in Alabama. Seems like it is taking advantage. So yeah, plenty to keep an eye on. Still on the recruiting show for 24, and then of course, Brandon, your grind doesn't stop really. You got to go right into 25 after that. It's like on and on and on you go.
Recruiting is a unique thing. I think next year I'll be on a plane like 30 to 35 weeks out of the year.
There you go. Get those miles. Get those jet miles.
How do you build a relationship with a kid if you don't
You
live in a
gotta. Yeah, it's tricky. Well, yeah, so plenty to watch out for on the recruiting trail and with this game. That's pretty much going to do it, Brandon. I want to end on this because I was asked this on another show I went on, and of course, we're recording this on Wednesday, and it is Thanksgiving season. It'll be on Thursday, and this will drop the day after, so everyone can enjoy their Black Friday festivities with a good little podcast. But Brandon, I want to ask you, put you on the spot again, your most difficult question of the day. What is your go-to Thanksgiving platter of food, your Thanksgiving meal?
I'm glad that you gave me the platter option instead of just like the one option. But
no, I don't. Yeah, we don't need. That's too hard. There's too many good options. What would you pick if you get fill plate up with whatever you'd like?
Well, my dad orders a turkey from East Texas, since I'm originally from Texas, every single year. I think it's like green something turkey. I don't know. It's like very, you know about it. But turkey, and then dressing. My grandma, before she passed away, she passed on the tradition of like, it's like duck dressing, so it's firm, but it has like some looseness to it, and it's a good situation. So
great, yeah,
the dressing, I always have to get some cranberry. I would take some cornbread casserole, and then some macaroni and cheese, and then the choice of like green beans or transparently a salad. But really bump all those. I really would rather just have Brussels sprouts. Actually, I may make those tomorrow for my family so I can have it for myself, but thankfully give them to them.
Spin zone it. Nice. That's a great platter. Yeah, I'm a big green bean casserole guy. I do like the green bean casserole. I'd go with that, and then just like I love mashed potatoes, turkey. Just plow a bunch of gravy on there. Have some dinner rolls. I mean, I'm pretty boring, but it's just great. Just eat a bunch of food. I'm not picky. You put a bunch of food in front of me, I'm gonna eat it. So
eat a bunch of food and watch some NFL. Even though I'm really in no
NFL.
rush to watch it. Ever since Taylor Swift got involved, I got uninvolved quickly.
Oh yeah, you're sick of that situation?
Yeah, and the Cowboys have been winning, so it's like no joy for me. I watch the NFL to watch them lose. So they've been winning, so it's like, okay, I don't care about anybody else. Yeah,
fair enough. I'm an unfortunate Seattle Seahawks fan, so I'm gonna have to watch them lose to the 49ers.
Oh yeah, you will lose to us. So yeah, you are losing to us.
Are you a Niners guy? Oh, we've got some beef, but yeah, I do not expect Seattle to win. You guys will probably wipe the floor.
5 of them.
We got one. Should have 2, but
Yeah, you want to throw it to a guy who's covered.
Don't get me started. All right. Well, yeah, everyone go enjoy the NFL. You've got some good college football, of course, on Black Friday too. So everyone tune into that and then watch the Alabama game, listen to the show. It'll be out on Friday for everyone to enjoy. But Brandon, happy Thanksgiving. And until next time for Tide Pod, we'll be back next week. We've got championship week coming up, Bama, Georgia. So we'll dive into all that and we'll talk some hoops next time as well. But until then, everyone enjoy your Thanksgiving. We'll see you next week.